Hello and welcome to my channel, In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne, and today I have another video in my on again, off again series of 6 degrees. And today it is the 6 degrees of Louisa May Alcott. Previously, I did a video about the 6 degrees of Bronte. And what I do with this series is I take an author and I make book recommendations, if you like that author, based on 6 different aspects of that author and their life and their work. So the first is books actually by the author. So books by Louisa May Alcott. Now everybody knows the obvious Little Women, right? So I wanted to make some suggestions that you may not have read. If you haven't read Little Women yet, definitely start with Little Women. It's her most popular book and the book that made her famous for a good reason. It's a fantastic book, but she also wrote some other great books as well. My personal favorite from my childhood, I've not read it in a long time, but my favorite from my childhood was Jack and Jill, which is kind of a play on the old nursery rhyme, Jack and Jill went down the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. And so I'm not going to tell you what happens in the story, but you can see that they are sledding, and maybe you can guess what happens. It's just a very charming story. When I was reading recently about Louisa May Alcott, she said that there are many actual characters and incidents in this story that are true to life in the area where she lived, Concord. So there were people that she knew that she put into this story and incidents that happened. And anyway, so there's a lot of actual true stories going on in here. I don't know which ones. I don't know if the story itself is based on something that actually happened. I don't really know. She didn't specify, but anyway, drawn from real life. More recently, I have discovered some other books by Louisa May Alcott. One thing that many people may not realize is that the majority of Alcott's career was built on her short stories that she published under her own name and that she was the recognized author of, and short stories that she wrote under various pseudonyms. The ones that she wrote under her own name were more for children, were more sentimental, moralistic kind of stories and tales. The ones that she wrote under pseudonyms were more adventuresome, sensational, and always featured dashing heroes or not quite heroic heroes, that sort of thing. Swashbuckling adventures, occasionally unrealistic settings or plot lines, whatever. A lot more fantastical, in a sense, than her other short stories. I have here The Hidden Louisa May Alcott, which is 2 volumes of those kinds of stories in one. I have read the first one in this book, which is Behind a Mask, or The Power of a Woman, which I talked about in a recent weekly reading wrap-up, so you can listen to that if you want to know more about that story. But also, she wrote many, as I said, short stories for children, for young people, for adults that were published in magazines and newspapers. One of them is Flower Fables, which she originally wrote as stories to tell the daughter of Ralph Waldo Emerson. The Alcott family was very close with the Emerson family, and so when Louisa was very young, she was very familiar with the Emerson children, and she would tell them stories. And this is a collection of some of the stories that she would tell Ralph Waldo Emerson's daughters. I've not yet read it as I am filming this, but I would really like to read this soon. And then Hospital Sketches I read recently and really enjoyed. It is told with a lot of humor and insight, and it is about Louisa's personal experiences as a nurse in DC in the Civil War. And she was only there for 6 weeks, but she has some very touching stories of some of the soldiers that she met, the interactions she had with them, and what she learned and what she experienced on that trip, all told in her very humorous and witty and self-deprecating style. So that is a very interesting book to read. And then we have not just books by Louisa May Alcott, but books about Louisa May Alcott, biographies, etc. The first one I want to mention is one, again, that I read recently and talked about in a recent video, Louisa's Life, Letters, and Journals, written by, or edited, I should say, by Edna D. Cheney, I believe was her last name. And This book is interspersed with Edna's biographical information and perspective on Louisa May Alcott, and actual letters that were written by Louisa May Alcott, as well as journal entries dating from her childhood all the way up until just before she died. And also includes poems that she wrote, which she never considered herself a poet. And aside from a few particular poems or songs that were commissioned for specific events and reasons, she didn't really publish any of her poetry. But she did write poetry for her family and for herself as a form of expression or interaction, showing affection for her family, for gifts or whatever. So those poems are included in each section of that book, which is a stage of her life, like childhood, early adulthood, career, etc. There is a poem that corresponds with that time period of her life that she wrote during that time period about things that were happening in that time period in her life. So that was really interesting addition to the book. I had not read any of her poetry before then. Well, that's not entirely true. There was one that was very familiar to me that I had read at some point, but the majority of the poems I had not heard before. So that was very interesting. And then another one that I would like to read is Selected Letters, which is compiled and edited by the two gentlemen who produced, which I don't have the copy on hand right now, but of The Inheritance. Daniel Shealy was one of them. I forget the name of the other gentleman. And they compiled, and so they read through all of the available letters of Louisa May Alcott, and they selected these particular ones to go into the book. And I am interested in reading that. I'm hoping that it would be more of a straightforward format of just her letters with maybe a little bit of contextual information provided, which was kind of missing from the book that I read. And then some other books that are more biographical. Well, I mean, those are definitely biographical, but they're more, her letters and information and stuff, but books about her. One is Louisa on the Front Lines, which again is based on her time in the Civil War, rather. And it is largely based on this book, but not just this book. It's building off of the information in that book, but also factual information from the time. And it's not just that period of time in her life, it's before and after what brought her to serve in the Civil War, and then the effects of it after her on her life and her family's life, etc. So I've not read this, but it looks very interesting to me. I wanted to read first the hospital sketches to get Louisa's perspective on it before I read a book about it written by someone else. But this is definitely on the short list of biographical books that I want to read about Louisa May Alcott. Also on my short list is this Eden's Outcast, which is about Louisa and her father specifically, who were both influential figures in the 19th century in America. And her father came first as an influential person as part of the Transcendental movement and the abolitionist movement. And he was often combined with the Emersons and Thoreau as being influential in American culture and society and philosophy of the time, of the day. So this is kind of a combined biography of both of those by John Madison, who is an expert on the Alcotts and has written extensively about the Alcott family, has done a lot of research on them. So I would really like to read this one at some point. I did not get to it for Alcott April, but again, made it to my short list. Several of the co-hosts had read Marmee and Louisa by Yves Laplante, which is a biography of Louisa and her mother. So you get Louisa and her father and a Louisa and her mother and the influence that she had on her life. Marmee was definitely a huge influence and impact on Louisa May Alcott's life. I think Marmee was a steadfast, steady influence throughout Louisa's life, and therefore was probably much stronger of an influence in who she eventually came to be. And then we have books that Louisa May Alcott read. And if I were to talk about all of the books that we know she read, because she recorded them in her diaries, her journals, her letters to people, she mentions them in the books that she wrote, she was an extremely well-read person. So if we took the time to list all of the books that we know that she read, the video would take like a whole day. So ain't nobody got time for that. So we're not going to do that. Instead, I chose to highlight a few that as I was reading her letters and journals, a few that like rose to the top as being incredibly influential in her life. that she really respected and obviously drew inspiration from. So the first one was being Dickens. Charles Dickens. She was a huge fan of Charles Dickens. Towards the end of his career, I would say that she admired him a little bit less, and she didn't expound on why. All I know is that when he died, she made a passing comment in a journal or a letter that his passing did not sadden her then as it would have maybe like 10 years previously. And then another one who had a lifelong influence on her was Goethe, German, hard to pronounce. Anyway, she read him from the time she was a young teenager, and his work had a profound influence on her. His Faust was a book that she kind of retold in a couple of different ways throughout her life. And in particular, there was a book called Goethe's Conversation with a Child by Bettina von Arnim. So there was a girl who, and I forgot to look this up, but I'm assuming this was actually happened, but I'm not 100% sure if it actually happened or if it was a fictional story. But there was a girl, a teenager, whatever, who, or maybe it was a young girl, I'm not sure. Louisa was definitely a teenage girl when she read about this. A girl who corresponded with Goethe, and it was just the story of that correspondence. And the idea of that so inspired Louisa May Alcott that she wrote letters to Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was her Goethe. And so she wrote to him, but she never actually sent them to him. And many years later in her life, she admitted that to him, and he wanted to see the letters, but I think by that point she had already like destroyed them. They were just like girlish, things that she had written. So when she was older, I think she was a little bit embarrassed by it, but that was the high esteem that she held both of those people in. So that brings me to my next one, which is Ralph Waldo Emerson. Again, I've already mentioned close friends of the family. She admired Ralph Waldo Emerson throughout her life for his character. Maybe not necessarily his writing so much, but his character, his wisdom, his friendship to her family, his friendship to her father, his loyalty and his goodness and his generosity. Those are qualities about him that she really admired. And then the Brontes, particularly Charlotte Bronte, she mentions she definitely enjoyed their books. She also really enjoyed Gaskell's biography of Charlotte Bronte and found that to be very inspiring just when she was on the brink of starting her career and had a lot of self-doubt and was wanting to pursue a literary career but struggling with getting it going, and was a little bit depressed. And so she was very much encouraged by the biography of Charlotte Bronte, and that kind of gave her a little kick. She also read a lot of books by Thomas Carlyle, who was a historian. I believe he was Scottish, and an essayist, and mentions him a lot and his works. She always said, by the way, side note here on this topic, on her being so well read, she always said that her education was inferior. And in fact, many people say that about her, that her education was inferior because she only went to an actual school for a couple grades, and maybe not even the full grade, just like months at a time here and there. And otherwise, her father taught her at home. And so from that, people often say that her education was inferior, and she would even say the same of herself. But I am sorry, the woman was extremely well-read and obviously had a depth of understanding of history, and seemed to have a competent enough understanding of mathematics and that sort of thing in order to make her way as an adult with a career, etc. She had a functioning understanding of it, at least. I think it's just because she didn't go to have any formal schooling. That's why they say she had an inferior education. But there are many people who were homeschooled or tutored or whatever, many historic people who had much better educations than people who actually go to a formal school and get a formal education in an institution. Just because she wasn't enrolled in a school for 12 years or whatever doesn't mean she wasn't well educated. I actually feel like she was more well educated than most of the people who graduate in Western culture today. But that's sort of a side note there. Another book is Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, which I did not know this, although now that I know it, I'm kind of like, duh. So probably everybody else in the world already knows this. But when she originally started writing Little Women, she was kind of working off themes of the Pilgrim's Progress and the idea of the girls in this story being on their own pilgrim journey. She was definitely going off of the Pilgrim's Progress idea of a pilgrim on the journey in the process of sanctification and the temptations that they meet and just what the journey is like on our way to the promised land, i.e. heaven. And the reason is because it was a very impactful book for her father. He read it when he was a teenager, and it had a profound influence on his life and influenced a lot of his beliefs, interestingly. And it informed many of his actions and thoughts and processes through the rest of his life. And it was a key book that the Alcott family read frequently together. It was a very important book for their family life and their family circle, and it was one that they had built a family culture around it. So that was incredibly influential in Louisa May Alcott's life, and that flows through her writing, especially in Little Women, where if you look at some of the chapter titles, you can see that they come from characters and places and incidents in the Pilgrim's Progress. The opening preface is a poem that is taken from a section in, I think it's the second Pilgrim's Progress, where it's his family, Christiana and her children. Definitely a huge influence on Louisa May Alcott and the whole family. Just a side note, as I was reading her journals and letters, there were a couple of authors that she particularly mentioned that she did not like. And one of them was George Eliot. And I haven't read much by George Eliot, but I sort of agree with her, because what I have read, I have found to be, well, Louisa May Alcott didn't say why she didn't like George Eliot in the portion that I read, but I don't love her because I find her to be excessively wordy, which is ironic because I feel like I am excessively wordy also, but anyways, in her narrative and her prose, too many words. And I also find that there's a bit of a condescending tone in her narrative also, which puts me off a little bit. That's my reasons. I don't know about Louisa May Alcott's reasons. And then we have Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who was a contemporary of Louisa May Alcott. Actually, their lives overlapped at some point. And they both were involved in the Civil War. They both were abolitionists. At some point in his life, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow lived in Boston. He was born in Maine, I think, somewhere else in New England. And they knew each other, or they met at least. I don't know that they are like friends or anything, but she did not like his poetry. And in fact, she said she didn't like any modern poetry. So I do like his poetry personally. I think it's very easy to read, and I just like it. It flows well. So I enjoy Longfellow's poetry, but she's not alone in not liking it. So then we have books about Louisa May Alcott's books. So the first one I want to mention is one that I read several years ago that I really loved. Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, The Story of Little Women and Why It Still Matters by Anne Boyd Rue. And I have mentioned this before on my channel, but it deserves another mention because it's just a great, easy to read history and analysis of Little Women, why it was important then, why it's important now, how people received it then, how people receive it now, the various adaptations that have been made of it, basically the whole history of Little Women, and looking at it from all kinds of angles, and the different ways that it has been perceived as time has gone on, and Louisa May Alcott's likely original intent in writing it, etc., all of that stuff. So that is a really good one to start with. It's very readable and approachable and an enjoyable read. At least I found it so. And then I saw this book at the Orchard House gift shop, and I really, 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 really wanted it, but it was like $36. And also it was very heavy. It's ginormous. I didn't want to bring it home on the train. So I didn't get it there, but I did borrow it from the library when we returned. And I already have like 3 copies of Little Women, but I kind of would really like to have this one as well. So maybe I'll put it on my birthday list because my birthday's coming up. But anyways, this is the annotated Little Women. Again, annotated by John Madison, who wrote one of the biographies that I mentioned earlier. The introduction alone is worth the book. because it provides such a great introduction to the book. Now, I recommend not reading it unless you've read the actual book. Definitely full of spoilers. But if you haven't read the book, it is a very informative introduction with a lot of information, a lot of things that I did not know about the book itself, about Louisa May Alcott, about the influences on the book, about how the book has influenced others, etc. And really a fantastic introduction. And then there's a biographical note with a quote, "We really lived most of it," that Louisa May Alcott said about the book. And it goes through, you know, the aspects in the story that are biographical. It has a short biography of the Alcott family and Louisa in particular. And then it has the actual Little Women. It's just really beautifully done. Such a beautiful copy on the inside. Look at that. And then, so it has the actual text here in a wide column, and then a skinnier column with notes and information about the books that influenced, or the books that they talk about, or pop culture things that were, you know, of that day. It explains them. It gives biographical notes and context in the notes. And then there are also, like, this is a picture of the actual orchard house. And then pictures from adaptations that correspond to the scene that is happening in the book. Here is a picture of actual costumes that the Alcott girls made for their little productions that they gave, and which is recorded in Little Women, and so many other things. Just really drawings and illustrations from other editions of the book. So just really totally worth it. I love this copy. I want one for myself. An amazing book. And then finally, I also checked out of the library and have kind of like dipped in this one, but haven't really read it straight through. Sorry, no, just to go there. Louisa May Alcott and Little Women, Biography, Critique, Publications, Poems, Songs, and Contemporary Relevance by Gloria T. Delamar. And this was written in 1990 and is kind of more of a scholarly, factual version of the Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy book that I mentioned before. It goes through the biography of Louisa May Alcott and the history of her career specifically, with all the details of that. And it talks about the public reception of Little Women at the time, the publishing process of it, the critics' acceptance of it or thoughts about it in the day when it was printed. And then, interestingly, every era after that, every new generation, how they perceived and received Little Women and what the literary critics wrote about it in every generation. So the changing perspective and shift on it. Very interesting. She also goes into all of the other things that Louisa May Alcott wrote in her life, including the lesser known things like the poems and songs that she wrote and some of her short stories and other things. And it has actual, you can see copies of where her little poems, whatever, were set to music and sung. One was a Christmas song that was published in a magazine, I think. No, it was specifically for inclusion in The Carol, a book of religious songs for the Sunday school and the home. One song was the John Brown song, was written for a special school assembly, and it appeared as a Sunday school hymn, other things. Anyway, her father for a time was the head of the Board of Educators, I think, or the board superintendent or something like that in Concord. And so he organized like district-wide assemblies and things, and Louisa would write songs for the children to sing for those. So this is one that she wrote. A Little Kingdom I Possess is the name of the poem, and it was set to the music, an English folk melody arranged by Riffon Williams. And I'll just sing the first verse. A little kingdom I possess, where thoughts and feelings dwell, and very hard I find the task of governing it well. For passion tempts and troubles me, a wayward will misleads, and selfishness its shadow casts on all my will and deeds. And that was printed with various music in various publications to be sung by children at home. And then books about Alcott's time and place. And I specifically focused on a few things that I knew were of important interest and passion to Louisa that happened in her lifetime that we would be interested in reading about as well. And one of those was the Underground Railroad, of course, because the Alcotts were involved in that at least on one occasion, but probably on other occasions. And obviously were very much champions of that. They were heavily involved in the abolitionist movement. So I found this book at the library, Fleeing for Freedom, Stories of the Underground Railroad, as told by Levi Coffin and William Still. And Levi Coffin and William Still are a white man and a black man who are attributed with starting and organizing the Underground Railroad and getting that going. And they told stories in later years of some of the people who traveled on the Underground Railroad to freedom in Canada. And so some of their stories are told in this book, which looks really interesting. And of course, there are so many books that I could mention in all of these categories, honestly. Every single category, I could mention hundreds of books, but I only mention the ones that I can show you and or that I have read and or that I really want to read myself. So I'm kind of sticking to a limited pile here. This one is called Fredericksburg. It is about the Battle of Fredericksburg, which is in Virginia, about an hour or so away from me. And this was the battle that had happened just prior to Louisa May Alcott coming to DC to serve as a nurse. And so the soldiers that she was helping with were all soldiers in this battle. They had been wounded in the Battle of Fredericksburg, which was a very bloody battle during the Civil War and kind of a bad moment for the North. Things did not go well for them in that battle, and there are actually multiple books written about it. But this one, the subtitle is The Destruction of Life Has Been Fearful and Nothing Gained, which is a quote about the battle. Just kind of sums it up. And so that is an interesting book that describes the battle and everything in it. Also, the Alcotts were big fans of Abraham Lincoln. And when I was looking for good biographies about him, which so many books have been written about him, more than any other, I think, American figure in history. This one I really want to read, added it to my to-be-read list, Lincoln's Unknown Private Life, an oral history by his black housekeeper, Mariah Vance, 1850 to 60. And I read the introduction about how this testimony came to be. This woman who had served in their family for 10 years. I'm not sure that she was with them in the White House, but she was with them like up until that point, serving as their housekeeper, Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln. And so she was a devoted believer, and she gave her story to a woman whose name I forget, Ada something or other, who recorded everything that she said in shorthand and kind of had a project in mind of publishing this story. But for some years, it just sat dormant, like, you know, she was distracted by life and everything. And so she wasn't able to actually publish it or anything. But then later on, someone else was wanting to, was researching Lincoln's life or something anyway. And so was connected with her. And so they found this amazing resource of a true eyewitness account of someone who actually had lived with the Lincolns. And yes, Ada Sutton, that was the name of the woman who recorded all of this. And so Lloyd Ostendorf and Walter Oleski in 1995 were the ones who took this lady's shorthand transcripts and rewrote it into this book, which tells the story of the Lincolns' family and their life at that time. So that looks really fascinating, and I definitely want to read that one. And then finally, books inspired by Louisa May Alcott. There are so many that have been written. I have not read most of them. Most of them, honestly, like retellings of Little Women. I generally like retellings of classic books, but the ones about Little Women don't interest me very much. A lot of times they take turns with the story that I don't want to read about. And they put a spin on it that is just not interesting to me, or in a setting, whatever, that doesn't particularly make me say, ooh, I want to read it. But I will mention one I have read that is really good, and that is Marmee by Sarah Miller, I believe is the author's name. I'll put the correct name up there if that's wrong. So, Marmee is a fantastic book. I read it last year. I will link to my videos about that. Great book. I recommend that one. And The Orchard House by Heidi Chavaroli. There's actually, I believe, a series of books that are written about the Orchard House and modern characters, but also they throw in some actual characters from history, including Louisa May Alcott herself. I've not read them, but this does interest me. I have it on Kindle. This I borrowed from the library, but I have it on Kindle that I want to read at some point, this book and the other books that are in the series. And finally, there's one that I'm on the fence about because I've heard good and bad things about it, and that is March by Geraldine Brooks, which is kind of like the version of Marmee, but the father's perspective, like the father's story. And it's kind of loosely drawn on actually Bronson Alcott's life, but also the Little Women story of him. So it's, again, like Marmee, it's a mix, and like Little Women, it's a mix of fact and fiction, and those lines get a little bit blurred. The thing is, what I've heard is I'm not sure that I would really like how they would describe his character, how true to life of actual Bronson Alcott. I would say, I don't know, but I'm thinking it's probably not 100% true to his character. And also seems to maybe not be true to the character of the father in Little Women either. So I don't know. I'm on the fence about that, but I've heard good things from some people and then other things from other people, like they didn't really like it. So we'll see. But that is just another one that's really popular that I wanted to throw out that seems to have some merit that many people have enjoyed. So there you have it, 6 Degrees of Louisa May Alcott, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.